Claire McGarry is the author of Grace and Tension, Discover Peace with Martha and Mary, and the Lenten family devotionals, Abundant Mercy and With Our Savior. She's the founder of Mosaic of Faith, as well as a regular contributor to Living Faith, Mornings with Jesus, and Catholic Mom. She's also a freelance writer, and her work has appeared in These Days, The Secret Place, Chicken Soup for the Soul books, and Keys for Kids, which is near and dear to my heart, as I looked forward to that arriving in my mailbox when I was a kid. And if that's not enough writing for you, she also blogs at shiftingmyperspective.com. Claire is a former lay missionary to Guatemala, now living in New Hampshire with her husband and 3 children. So welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, thanks for being here. So that told us a lot about you, mostly professionally, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about Guatemala. How long did you live there? Were you a single woman? And then what brought you to New Hampshire?
Sure. So I was in Guatemala for 3 years through Franciscan Mission Service. I chose them specifically because of St. Francis. His motto is preach the gospel always, use words when necessary. Yes. And for me, I find people's example to be what inspires me most, not as much as their words, but their example. So that's why I chose Franciscan Mission Service. So I was there for 3 years and did a variety of jobs, but primarily worked with a children's sponsorship program. So families from the U.S. would sponsor a Guatemalan child, and I would visit the home of the child and help them write their letter and then translate it into English, send it to the States, and then when it came back, translate it back into Spanish from the host family and bring it to the child and the gifts or whatever the money was allocated to be used for. Because sometimes it wasn't just for the child. If there was something, a tool that would help the dad farming, which ultimately would put food on the table for the child. So it was, a little
more holistic for the whole family.
Got it.
Yeah.
You got it. And so then lots happened when I came back, but eventually met and married my husband. I was born and raised in Massachusetts, and that's where I met him, and that's where we were living. And that's where we started our family. But anyone from this area knows that once you cross the border from Massachusetts into New Hampshire, actually not so much now, but back when we moved 17 years ago, you could get a bigger home on a bigger lot for the same price that you could get a teeny tiny home on a teeny tiny lot in Massachusetts. So that was the inspiration behind moving to New Hampshire, and we love it here. Best decision we ever made. Yeah.
Yes. We've done something similar recently, moving from Chicagoland in Illinois into Northwest Indiana, because cost of living is just less and you get a little more. And that was good for our family. So I totally understand that.
Yeah.
Oh, well, excellent. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit more about the thing that you know, which is ultimately this tension between doing and being. But before we get to the heart of that tension between being a Mary and a Martha, let's back up a little bit. Because as you know, this is a podcast for mompreneurs. And so we especially talk about the things that make it easier to be our best as both mom and entrepreneur. So tell us a little bit about your mompreneur journey as you created a business around writing.
Sure. So in the beginning, it was very much where the little pockets I could find in the midst of motherhood.
Yes.
So motherhood and my kids were top priority. They were little, they were demanding. I was drowning most times. And so it was where the little pockets I could fit it in. And then simultaneously, they were growing up and becoming more independent at the same time that I was getting a little more traction in writing. And so the scale tipped the other way. Now I'm able to, the big rock that I place in the jar first now is like interviews like this, where my kids now have to go entertain themselves, be quiet. They know they have to be respectful. And so I can plan family life a little bit more around writing, interviews, deadlines, whatever pops up in the writing world. A lot of it because I can be in charge of a good portion of the scheduling. That's the beauty of it, versus if I had an office job where I had to be there at certain hours. So that flexibility helps, but that shift has definitely happened between fitting it in and now working around it.
Yes. And that's interesting to hear you point out that even when life was crazy, this was important. And so you found, I've heard it described elsewhere as the cracks and the chunks. And so you found those crack times to work on it, which is what gave you what you were, when you had chunk time, you were ready to take advantage of that in a way you wouldn't have been if you hadn't just started doing it.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So what were the main priorities that you wanted to focus your energy on when it came to your family and when it came to your business? And really, as you began to be published and had deadlines, how did you balance those? I mean, you mentioned the shift in control, but sometimes, even though you don't have a, 9 to 5, sometimes there's a deadline, and that does sort of dictate what happens. So how do you tackle all those things?
Well, for my family, my top priorities are values and quality time. I feel like, especially as I have 2 boys that are teenagers and a daughter who's a tweenager. And so, they have social media, they're on their phones, they're on Netflix and all these other streaming services that don't have the same censorship that primetime television has, although those lines have wiggled a whole lot. Yes. So I have to work very hard to keep them grounded, and it's a top priority to keep them grounded in our values and morals. And just a quick side note, the beauty of the pandemic was just that. I was able to pull them back in because the outside world shut down. And so I was able to root them deeper, as well as quality time. So I do have less time than I did before, so that when there is time to be together, to try to make it more quality, more memorable, but also to taking advantage of every single moment along the way, which kind of drives my kids crazy, of turning it into a teaching moment. They're like, oh, here she goes again. So those are my priorities for family. As far as my writing goes, my top priority is to write for God, because all of my writing is faith-based. It's all rooted in scripture. It all comes from my time in prayer. So that is absolutely my top priority there. And as far as juggling it all and managing deadlines and priorities, ever since my kids were little, my husband and I established a routine where every Saturday morning, we call it being on deck. He's on deck for Saturday morning. So that is my time to get my coffee and my breakfast, go up into my room, and then I'm on deck on Sunday. He can go off and go running with his friends. But during my time on Saturday morning, I call it my global planning. I take a look at the entire week coming up and do strategic planning of how it's all going to work. And sometimes when you get that time and space, sometimes when you're too mired in it, it's hard to recognize the priorities. But if you have that quiet time, and I blend it in with my prayer time, the priorities bubble up to the top. I have a lot more clarity in how to fit it all in. And so it becomes this strategic scheduling session. And it's also the time when I pick up all those balls that I dropped from the previous week.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I love that concept, because you've negotiated well then with your husband all of the needs, personal, business, family, in a way that says, how can we work as a team to move us all forward, instead of, me, you don't do enough for me, or I'm always doing for you. So I love that. That's a fabulous way to think about it. I think some of us do that, but we haven't named it. And so naming it, I think, is really helpful to say, yes, this is of value, what I'm doing here.
And it also gives me hope during the week when I feel those balls all crashing down. It's okay. On Saturday, I'll regroup.
Yes.
So to know that time is coming, and the priority is to pull it all back together, gives me hope. And I feel, I feel more confident as I go through my week.
Because you've built in margin essentially to say, okay, it's okay. I've got time. So, well, I often say that every business yes can feel like a parenting no, and that's when mom guilt kicks in. But the reality behind that statement is that it is choosing a task over a relationship, and that highlights that tension between doing and being, which is a good segue to talk about Mary and Martha. But not everyone listening comes from a faith background. So why don't you take a minute and tell us exactly who Mary and Martha are and what their names have become synonymous with in today's culture?
Sure. So Martha and Mary are from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, 38 to 42, and they are friends of Jesus. They're also the sisters of Lazarus. So Jesus is passing through with his disciples and decides to stop and visit with them. And it becomes a dinner party, in essence, in today's terms.
Yes.
And in the process of the dinner party, the sisters make different choices. Mary chooses to sit at the feet of Jesus and listen to everything that he has to say, where Martha chooses to do and prepare and cook the meal and serve the meal. But in this process, there is a lot of tension because Martha takes on too much and gets worried and distracted and goes to Jesus and says, tell Mary to get up and help me. So I think the world at large labels the two sisters as Mary is the one being with Jesus and Martha is the one doing for Jesus.
Yes. So I'm very task oriented and I tend to relate a little bit more to Martha. And so I cringe when I hear this story and the bottom line is often said, Mary equals good and Martha equals bad. And then it's widely applied to all things domestic or relational. And in reality, both are needed and necessary, but it's situational. It's the situation that drives what the priority is. And I would go even further to say that that's one of the reasons why we want to put in the hard work of doing and making good systems so that it supports us and gives us the time and the space for connection and flexibility for relationship. But what is the tension that you see at play? And how did you come to this idea of grace and peace being necessary from both perspectives?
Well, what happened was, like everyone, I feel stress and tension. And I think we all felt that ratchet up big time during COVID. Mm-hmm. And it was while reflecting on this scripture passage, like you, I was relating to Martha. And I'm a big Martha cheerleader. I think she gets the short end of the stick because, like you said, her choices are labeled bad and Mary's are labeled good. And I don't believe that's the case. And I try to make that case for Martha in the book. But there is so much to be learned from the both of them. Mm-hmm. And it was while meditating on this passage and reflecting on my life in general and how I had always handled stress and tension. I shouldn't say always, the times that I had handled it positively, because there are certainly times I did not go through my stress and tension with grace. But every time I brought it to the feet of Jesus and every time I spent time with him, he revealed a gift tucked within the tension. And I started to recognize that tension can actually be a positive. Tension is telling us something isn't right. Something needs to change, whether we need to change an outward task or systems that we've put in place that aren't working anymore because what might have worked, at the beginning of our business doesn't work as it grows. What might have worked when our kids were little doesn't work as they get older. And sometimes the change needs to happen inwardly because it's our response to something that is getting the train off the track. And so I recognized in that process of spending time with him that there was actually a pattern to the steps he was taking me through. And the very cool thing is that this GIFT acronym sort of floated up from the notes that I had taken and from all my journaling, and that the GIFT acronym actually are the steps. So that G of GIFT is gauge. So when we go to the feet of Jesus, we need to gauge or identify or name what our stress and tension is. Because I think far too often we label the symptom and not the root cause. You cannot fix something if you haven't identified or gauged what it is, right? Because focusing on the symptom doesn't fix the problem. So then comes the I of GIFT. I felt God asking me to invite my tension in. So if it's not going to put us in spiritual and mortal danger, I believe he wants us to sit with it. Because sometimes the more we run away from it, the more it grows. But if we can face it and look it in the eye, we loosen our hold on the emotions around it. And when we loosen our hold on our emotions, they lose their hold on us. And that's when we get clarity, because it's our emotions that cloud the picture. So that's when we can use that F from the word gift, which is looking through the filter of God's loving eyes. Because I truly believe he is always working for our good, even in the midst and through our stress and tension. So when we can finally see the situation through his eyes, that's when we can identify the good. Once we've identified the good, he illuminates the T, which is what we need to do to transform that stress and tension into grace, and he partners with us so we don't feel overwhelmed. You know, and usually it's just a baby step. Usually it's just a minor change, but that gauge, invite, filter, transform is what helped me realize there's a pattern, but there's also a gift, and that tension is telling us something. And we need to just take a pause, check in with him, and he'll lead us through to see. Because once we implement that, everything just smooths out. It's you could think of it magically, but it's actually miraculously.
Right. Well, and it's interesting, that first one with the G of gauging, because I learned, with my parenting that, all behavior is a symptom of something else happening. But we are often, so I've learned to shift my parenting from the symptom and the behavior to what is causing this. But I've never really thought about that for me. Like, how do I sit and say, oh, yes, so when I behave this way, I'm focused on fixing that behavior as opposed to thinking about an underlying root cause for it. So that's a little eye-opening. So I appreciate that. And so you do talk a lot about balance. And, years ago, I wrote an article on balance and talked about the tightrope and how tension is good. If you don't have tension, you can't cross it. If you have too much tension, it's going to snap, and you need the right amount of tension for something to work well. I mean, it's the same with, pressure from the outside and keeping things together. But so this GIFT acronym then is really how you would say we would strive to achieve balance in our life by going through this with whatever it is that is frustrating us or causing us stress. Is that correct?
Yes. And I think what I believe happens in that passage with Martha and Mary is each in their own way go through that and then have more lessons to teach us in order to keep that balance. So I think Mary, for example, I do this hypothesis that perhaps what I noticed was initially when Jesus arrives at the door, Mary is not there. And I wondered, what if she were actually in the kitchen? What if she were actually doing for him initially? If that were the case, I think she would have felt tension and quickly identified it because she's such an intuitive person. And so I think what Mary teaches us is that our tension can be a bridge to cross back over and choose again. But then I had the thought, okay, she chooses to sit at his feet. What if she were sitting at his feet full of guilt because she knows she left it all to Martha? What if she were spending her time at his feet ruminating more on, ooh, I should be in the kitchen. I should be helping her. Ooh, she's going to be mad at me. Did I make a wrong choice? Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes when we make a right choice for the wrong reason, we're not living out our better part because our head and our heart isn't aligned. Yes. Or aren't aligned. And so I imagine if that were the case, Mary would have figured out, okay, I have this golden opportunity. Jesus is in my living room. I've got to let go of that guilt. I've got to be fully present. And that's why it says, and listened to all he said. And I believe that's her better part was twofold, right action with right intention. Mm-hmm. Because if we don't have the right intention, and that's that balancing act, right? So if we take on too much and we take it on for the wrong reasons, that's when we feel overwhelmed.
Yes.
Because our heart and our head are no longer aligned. And that's when the stress ratchets up. But I'm sure you've had the same experience of having an incredibly busy day, just one thing after another. But when your heart is in it, when you're doing it for all the right reasons, it's astounding how our energy level maintains what is in front of us. It's like that multiplication of the fishes and the loaves. Suddenly our energy level is multiplied. We get through the day. We still have time for ourselves at the end. It's this wacky shift of time, this time warp. Right? Because our head and our heart are aligned. Mm-hmm. And the thing that Martha teaches us is that when we are overwhelmed, regardless of all the choices that Martha made and all the intentions of why she did, and I go through a lot of them in my book about, taking on too much, and she could have deferred things to another time, or maybe she's busy comparing herself. Whatever she didn't do correctly, the one thing she did 100% right is she went to Jesus when it was all falling apart. And that's, I believe, an incredible takeaway from that passage is when we have either chosen the right action with the wrong intention or chosen the wrong action and are feeling unbalanced, he is the one to go to realign and figure things out.
Yeah, that's excellent. And when those things are in alignment, then that's when we can be present in what we're doing and not distracted by the others or thinking about where we'd rather be at that time or what we should be doing instead. And that's really what feeds the quality in that quality time is being present, not just physically. It's easy to be distracted. Well, that is so helpful to look at it through that way too. And I've often wondered, if they'd had an Instant Pot, that would have changed everything for them,
No, I still think Martha would have, she still would have added, had she had that time-saving device, she would have added another task to the plate.
Okay.
and I think that's what we Marthas do. We find shortcuts, but then we think, oh, the shortcut just gave me more time. Let me add something else to my plate.
Yes. Well, that was a good description of getting into overwhelm. And that is very much part of my backstory was, out of people pleasing, I said yes to everything and didn't say no to anything and didn't take anything off my plate. And so got to that point of, I can't do it, nor should I have been doing it all. And, God graciously allowed it to all come crashing down to rebuild out of that. But yes. So there's a mompreneur listening, I know, who feels overwhelmed. And so that acronym will be very helpful to start to implement. But what is one specific thing she can do today to extend that grace and peace to herself as she's building her business and raising her family and feeling that tension between the two?
I think a heart check. I think, because I think far too often we do head checks. We check in and we're trying to organize everything in our heads and we forget to do a heart check. And if the head and the heart align, then the choice is a good one. And I think similar to how we, it's not fun to discipline our children. but we do it because of the larger purpose, which is we know ultimately it will help them in the end. And so if we do that head and heart check of I'm doing this with right intention, it gives us the resolve to carry it through. So when it comes to business, if there's a choice that we're making that might be from an outsider's perspective, shortchanging our family, we need to do a heart check and say, is this for the greater good? Is this so that I can grow my business in order to benefit my family? And am I teaching my children a good lesson of everything does come with choices, and my choices for the right intention? And that only happens when we do a heart check of why am I making this choice? Is it for the greater good? And if it is, there will be that peace in your heart. And if it's more out of selfish reasons and avoidance, right? I booked all these appointments today so I could avoid my kids because it's a snow day and they're home or whatever.
Right.
If that intention isn't right, you're not going to feel that peace in your heart. So a quick heart check. And the more you do it, the more you practice it, the better you get and the quicker your answer comes.
That's excellent. And I another guest at one point described that as the planting versus the harvesting. And sometimes we have to have these intense periods of time that do take us away from our family, but it's temporary and it's for a bigger result later. And so I think that's a good reminder to have that filter to say, where is this? And, what are my motives? Now, there's things I would love to avoid that I still have to do for the business and the family. So that may not always be my best filter, but anyway, I think that's excellent, and I'm looking forward to getting a copy of the book and reading it. So I'm excited about this. So as we wrap up, one of the things that I like to ask every guest, it's a little more lighthearted and fun, but what is your favorite time-saving gadget, system, or tool?
My dust buster.
Okay.
I don't know if everyone knows what that is, but it's a small little handheld vacuum. It charges on a cord. And when you have to do a quick cleanup, you take it off the cord. It's nice and light. When my kids were little, I could assign it to them to just do it. I find everything gets kicked to the outer perimeters, right? In the kitchen. And so one task would be they would every day have to vacuum the outer perimeter of all the rooms. And then anything big they saw in the middle of the room. So not only is it my quick tool, but it's an easy tool to delegate to your kids. You can also bring it to your car and clean up your car real quick. And it's just and I finally learned to invest in a good one because then it lasts longer and it actually does the job in half the time.
Okay. So I was going to say I've had them in the past and they just didn't hold up. So that's, yes.
So high end, it's worth every penny.
Good to know. Good to know. Well, thank you so much, Claire, for your time today. How can people connect with you?
So I do have a blog called Shifting My Perspective, which is about how God always transforms how I view things. So shiftingmyperspective.com, or they can reach it by clairemcgarry.com. They'll end up in the same place.
Okay.
But I just want to thank you, Jen. I've really enjoyed my time with you, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity.
Oh, well, thanks for being here.